There are some skills and strategies. I want to take you back to the image of the toolbox. And again, for parents of younger children, if you're not having a lot of behavior problems, I am not predicting them. But I want you to have these tools, these skills in your box if you need to teach some of this to other members of your family or community. You have it there for you. The first thing I want to do is make a distinction between behavior modification and behavior management. This is a distinction. When I first heard it, I said, right, there's different terminology for the same thing, but really not. Behavior modification is what we do when we toilet train a child. Also true for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, because they also get toilet trained by usually roughly the same method, which is you give a lot of reinforcement for the behavior initially, and then you can withdraw the reinforcement, and the individual continues the behavior. And that's behavior modification. Behavior management is what the state police do on the turnpike. And that is that they give out tickets for speeding. And if they ever announce that everybody's learned your lesson now and we're going to stop giving out tickets, we all know what would happen. So the tickets are the behavior management. As soon as you withdraw the consequence, you will see the behavior reemerge. So for some behaviors, behavior modification does work. But for a lot of what you're dealing with Prader-Willi syndrome, if you withdraw the incentives and the consequences, certain behaviors will reappear. And any kind of food-seeking behavior will always come back when you loosen up on the food security. This is a concept that's especially important for people who are in the provider industry, because the prevailing philosophy is you provide a lot of supports, and then as the person becomes more independent, you withdraw those supports and they continue on their way. Now, there's a fiscal reason for this as well as a philosophical reason for this. But what I like to say to providers, particularly administrators, about this is our goal for individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome is not so much independence as maximal function with support. And that maximal function can really be quite good. But I have seen folks who've had that support withdrawn even after years, and immediately things started to unravel. The other thing about behavior is people often think that it's mostly a matter of intervention. But in fact, intervention is a very small part of behavior management, and I even prefer not the word intervention as much as response. And the last part of my talk, I will talk about what we mean, or what you want to do when you're responding to a behavior that you don't like, and get the idea of intervention more or less out of your mind. The big part of behavior management is prevention. And I just pulled the number out of the air, 95% prevention, 5% response. But it really is something like that. The bulk of what you're going to do with behavior management is going to be prevention. And your prevention, the tool for prevention, is infrastructure. What's infrastructure? These are plans that you have in place before the behavior begins. Now, you can immediately think back to the food security talk and realize that a lot of food security comes from infrastructure. The reason we need infrastructure is that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have a limited amount of coping ability. And the infrastructure provides them with a safer, more predictable environment so they don't have to cope as much. The typical person uses a number of coping tools, and they're here for you: intellectualization, problem solving, seeking social support, and escape avoidance. And we all use these coping mechanisms. The person with Prader-Willi syndrome really has a lot of trouble intellectualizing. They are not great problem solvers. They will use social support, but they will not necessarily seek it. So it has to be offered as part of their infrastructure. And they can use escape avoidance in very inappropriate ways. But they have to be taught how to use escape avoidance appropriately. So where you actually say, when you're feeling like that, when you feel like breaking something or saying bad words, it would be good for you to go to your room. And you structure them and teach them a useful escape and avoidance. So when you're dealing with behavior problems, you want to try to make sense out of them so that you can respond appropriately. One thing to keep in mind, and you might even get tired of us saying this, but stress leads to behavior symptoms. And so when you're working with behavior symptoms, you want to think, stress, where is it coming from? And here's some major sources of stress. And this is especially true in group home kind of situations, but it can happen in school with a change in teachers or a change in routine that results in some food insecurity. Punitive attitude, that's the person who tends to use, if you don't do this, then this is going to happen. With the person who uses threats, the person who's angry because of the child's behavior. Changes in caretakers, it's just true that you have to end up retraining every new teacher, every new caretaker that you come in contact with. And hopefully we can provide more and more useful information to make this easier for you. But there are just some life transitions that are unavoidable, and they are a source of stress, and it can be a time where you'll see an increase in symptoms of various kinds. Changes in family constellation. One I see is when siblings younger siblings overtake an older sibling with Prader-Willi syndrome in skills and independence and get the driver's license and have their own money. That's one major stressor. And another is when those same siblings, some of whom have become very helpful to the parents, now move out of the home. And there are fewer people there to be part of the maintenance team. Changes in schedule, holidays, vacations, we all know about that. Some families completely skip Christmas. I think there's a way to deal with holidays using some of our no doubt, no hope principles, but some families, one family I know with two extremely anxious individuals just skipped it altogether. Deaths and illness, these are unavoidable, but it helps to know that this can be a trigger for a change in behavior problems. So what are the symptoms, the tip-offs? The first thing that happens is that you will see an increase in what we call normal Prader-Willi syndrome behaviors. You see more anxiety, maybe some more tantruming, crying, perseveration, arguing. Food seeking can go up with stress, and sometimes incontinence. There are also some behaviors that we consider abnormal, although we frequently see them in stressed persons with Prader-Willi syndrome. So they're normal Prader-Willi behaviors, or abnormal Prader-Willi behaviors. I'm not sure which. But we do see them usually in very stressed individuals, although it gets complicated, and I'll be happy to talk about some of these in detail. Okay, so what we're providing, in place of the pink coping protector, we have to provide an environmental buffer. And the child with Prader-Willi syndrome, in a sense, has to live in an artificial environment, because it's artificial to have food locked up, and it's artificial to have everybody know that you cannot be offered food willy-nilly, but that is what they need. And when there's a breakdown in the environmental buffer, you have to expect increased behavior problems. But what really happens is you don't wake up one morning and saying, we're having a breakdown in our environmental buffer. Okay? What happens is you realize we're having increased behavior problems. What the heck is going on? And then I want you to work backwards through this paradigm. All right, it's probably increased stress. Am I seeing any other signs of stress? There must be some kind of uncertainty, some doubts, some hopes, or other uncertainty, either about food or about other things. And then finally, you realize that there's been a change or a breakdown in your environmental buffer. So you have to work backwards, or I like to call it reverse engineering the behavior problems. Infrastructure then creates your buffer. So what is your infrastructure? These are the components, and I'm going to go through each one. Okay. Now, my choice of wording may strike you as strange, but there's a reason for that. It creates an acronym. I'm going to teach you to be tricky. Okay. And the first item is the T in tricky, and it's build your team. You need a minimum of 2 team members. I have seen the occasional single parent doing just great, but by and large, if you are a single parent, try to recruit a brother, a sister, an ex, your mother, your father, and lots of single parents have already recruited someone. But don't stop there. Recruit older children, grandparents, teachers, neighbors, relatives, and train these people up ahead of time so that you aren't not only are they doing the right thing, but they aren't questioning what you're doing, okay? Your goal is to outnumber your child, okay? And these are some basic philosophies that your team needs to have, and this is especially important in group homes because a lot of people will come in, or teachers in schools, they come in and they know this much about the syndrome and they immediately develop a theory. And their theory is going to be wrong. I'll be very blunt about that because this syndrome is so counterintuitive. It goes against common sense. And it's so complex and it's so variable that all of us are wrong a lot, especially in the beginning. So here's some advice or philosophical concepts that I think have been very helpful when I've worked on a team that all understood these things. I recommend that you never verbally attribute the behavior problem to Prader-Willi syndrome. Rather, it's better to hold your child accountable for his or her own behavior. There's really no alternative to this. You cannot give them a blanket permission or excuse for their behavior. You're really not being fair to them. And finally, though, the compromise is that you acknowledge that because of Prader-Willi syndrome, he needs more help to control his behavior, and then we're going to provide that help. Other things that the team should know is that you never threaten, okay? And you also never bribe, never argue, and never give in. These also work very well with general rearing of adolescent children. In fact, everything in this lecture applies to all children, including ourselves. Calm voice helps. This works with husbands. Calm voice, positive statements. Food security. Husbands need food security too. But food security is one of the principles that your team needs to be trained in. Okay. The next item in our tricky acronym is rules. They're based on the no doubt, no hope. So your rules are designed to prevent occasions for doubts and hopes, avoiding temptation, and of course, continuous supervision. Now, one of the issues that parents raise, and I think it's an excellent point, is what about fairness? And so you have to prepare your child for the concept that everyone has rules, but not everyone has the same rules. Because the trap that some families fall into is that when their child is small, particularly if he has other younger brothers and sisters, you can use all the same rules. But as the child gets older, he needs different rules. And if you have set the standard as being fair and everyone getting the same thing and everyone having the same rules, you're going to head into a rocky adolescent period as your other children grow into more independence. The I in tricky is incentives. These are things that are contingent on completing scheduled tasks. So incentives can be lost, and that's why it's an incentive. The number one biggest incentive is social. That is giving praise and approval. And I think one of the wonderful things about Prader-Willi syndrome is they love it. They respond to it. They thrive on it. They seek it. But we also use tangibles because they are concrete thinkers. And you can use stickers, tokens, special attention, scheduled special attention, and food incentives. The incentives are there to reinforce desirable behaviors. And the important thing about the tangible incentives is that they're scheduled. And that's the difference between incentives and bribery, because bribery is something you come up with on the spur of the moment saying, well, come on, if you'll do this, you'll get this. But instead, the child knows, as a matter of routine, that when he finishes his morning and when he does his exercise, he gets certain things. That's an incentive. Now, for some individuals, an incentive once a day or twice a day scheduled into the program is enough. Some children who are having a rough adjustment to a new situation might need hourly incentives. They might need some kind of tangible incentive like a sticker or a token every 15 minutes. We've made these recommendations for children in certain school situations. So they tend to be layered in frequency, and they can be cumulative. What that means is that you can keep score, and they not only get a token or a star or a point for that behavior, but when the tokens and the stars and the points add up, then there's another reward. That way, if they lose their token or their star or their point for the morning, they still have reason to stay on track. What I've seen people make the mistake of doing is having an incentive, a reward at the end of the day for a good day. And if the person has a meltdown at 9 o'clock in the morning and loses his incentive, he has no more incentives left. So you have to have a series of incentives so that even when someone loses an incentive, there's another incentive already built into the schedule. What you don't want to do is to relent and say, oh, okay, well, all right, you can still have it, or you still have a chance for it. You can't do that. They have to lose the incentive, but you have to have another one in place. This is infrastructure. So the opportunity to earn rewards and tokens is frequent enough for the child's individual cognitive and behavioral needs. And as I said, for most folks, a couple of tangible rewards a day works, but sometimes it has to be much more frequent. The child is always working on something. If they lose a reward, there are always other rewards in sight, and you immediately remind him of that, okay? And you use, sometimes you might get a tangible reward like sugarless gum as well as a token, and the tokens add up and the sugarless gum speaks for itself. These are two of the rewards that we often use on a daily basis, and that's why I emphasize so much that they can't have free access to these things because you need to use them as part of the incentive program. Non-food incentives, though, are your mainstay. Computer time, TV time, mommy time, daddy time, sometimes time with a special supervisor, somebody who's not there all the time, works very well in group homes. Game time, and stickers and star charts. Again, these might be rewards in and of themselves. Sometimes children like certain kinds of stickers, puffy stickers or dinosaur stickers, and that's a reward in and of itself. But there are also stickers that they just add up like points or tokens, and there's a cash-in opportunity at the end of the week. Now, we like the concept of the red food. We just call it the red food. But in fact, the child is getting small amounts of red food, say butter or margarine in very small amounts with his regular diet. But this is a special treat that the child receives, and depending on his weight, even the folks who badly need to lose weight get a red food once a month. Twice a month can be used in individuals who have good weight control. This is a non-contingent treat. That is, remember, no doubt, no hope. It's a non-contingent treat. They absolutely know they're going to get it. And you work it into whatever special occasion you have to cope with that month. Okay? So the individual knows he's going to get a red food, and you can have a discussion at the beginning of the month. Well, this is February, and so we can have a red food for Valentine's Day. But if you have a birthday also happening in February, then you have to figure out how you're going to do that. If the child's weight is under control, you might be able to use a red food for both. You never threaten the loss of the red food. And if there is bad behavior, it can be postponed but not lost. But I have to tell you, on the red food day, there's very little bad behavior. The red food is a real treat. In our program, when an individual is on a 600-calorie diet, they can have a 300-calorie red food once a month. And it's not diet pie or diet ice cream. It's the real thing. And I think it's because it takes advantage of the fact that people with Prader-Willi Syndrome can focus and obsess all month long on that red food and enjoy it over and over and over again mentally. Okay. The next part of your toolbox is consequences. They are, for the most part, simply loss of the incentives. But there are natural consequences. If you go somewhere and you act out and misbehave, you're not going to be able to go there anymore. That's just basic logic. Or you may not be able to go there again for a long time. Okay? So you can say to the child, you know, because of the meltdown we had in the checkout line at the Walmart, we won't be able to go to the Walmart again for quite a while. And when we do go back, we're going to a different Walmart. Okay. The other thing about consequences is they're all, it took you a while to get that. Okay. The other thing about consequences is that they're planned. That is, the team has to know for this particular behavior, which is a recurrent problem, this is how we're going to handle it. So different members of the team are not handling the behavior differently. And then, of course, the loss of incentives is just built in, so that most of the time you shouldn't have to be coming up with consequences. They should already be agreed upon, and for recurrent behaviors, or simply not doing what you're supposed to be doing, for those behaviors, it's already set, it's already established. In fact, it's cookbook. It ends up being cookbook, and that's exactly what it should be. And all of this should be written up. If you are trying to cope with a lot of behavior problems, you want to have this tool. So you don't threaten with consequences. You simply remind the child that the incentive is there waiting for him to earn it. So you say, come on, hurry up and get dressed so you can get your gum this morning, or hurry up and get dressed so we can do this. You don't threaten. The loss of the incentive, if they do lose the incentive, it's automatic. You inform them that they've lost it. It's matter of fact. You don't say, oh, you blew it now. You've lost your incentive. You just say, well, you didn't get your gum this morning, but don't forget, you can earn your gum this afternoon. Now, this takes self-discipline. And you will hear other members of your team, including husband and wife, you will hear people phrasing this wrong. And when you're alone later, you can coach the other person and say, when you hear me saying it the wrong way, you point that out to me, but not in front of the child. Okay? But teams require coaching, and you probably have to coach each other. When you are first introducing a new behavioral program, you have to expect tantrums. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it right. And when a child is extremely upset, disappointed, even tantruming, remember, you can be emotionally supportive to the child without giving in. And this is appropriate for any 2-year-old. You can support them and hug them even, unless the tantrum is for attention, then you can't. But if they've undergone a real disappointment, you can sympathize and say, I'm sorry you lost your sugarless gum for this morning, but you have a chance this afternoon. And you encourage them, but you don't give in, you don't waver, you don't say, well, let me think about it. That's deadly. Okay. The next thing that you want to remember is that the child needs to know what to expect, and the team needs to know what to expect. And this is because there are certain cognitive and memory problems with the children, and some of them, again, need this more than others. Some children need a huge amount of structure and support in remembering what to expect, and others have it down cold, and they will recite it back to you and argue with you about it if you will let yourself get sucked into it. But there are verbal reminders, the schedule, the rules, and the incentives, no threats. Posted schedules. Some children do well at school carrying around a handheld schedule. Posted menus, star charts, whatever tools you need, resort to them. Repetition and consistency are your friends. And the last tool that you may need is yelling for help. These are contingency plans. And this is for the child who's had, in the past, some sort of major behavioral problem on a special occasion. And these are usually, they look very manipulative. They are manipulative, but they also have to do with stress. The stress of not knowing. Because people, even people with Prader-Willi syndrome, will not manipulate when there's no hope of success. The quickest way to teach a child not to manipulate is by not being manipulated, by not letting yourself be manipulated. Again, another thing that you have to teach your teen. But when you're moving into family party, holiday, graduations, weddings, some occasion that you really don't want to have ruined, but you don't want to exclude the child either, one strategy is to have an escape plan, a plan for what happens if this behavior or some other behavior occurs. And this is your escape plan, so that don't ever let embarrassment also motivate you for the way you do, but it is a factor, and sometimes your host or hostess can be embarrassed. But you have an escape plan. If this behavior occurs, we brought 2 cars, and Dad's going to leave with you, and I'm going to stay here. And your child knows you have this plan. This is, again, for a child who's had a recurrent behavior. Once the child knows you have a plan, he's much less likely to need the plan. And you may have to implement the plan a couple of times. But then the child learns that he's not going to be able to stop the party. He's not going to be able to blackmail you into a red food that he wasn't scheduled to have. And he's not going to be able to manipulate you because you already have a plan. And so that's what yelling for help is about. Now, the last concept I want to come back to is, what about your response when the behavior is going on? Now, this is extremely important when even though I give it 5% of your work as response, but if you're successful, you're doing more behavior problem prevention than you are response. But your response sets the stage for preventing behaviors in the future. So the most important thing is, don't do anything that's going to encourage the same behavior in the future. And that's why giving in and bribery are so destructive. Arguing can be fun for a person with Prader-Willi syndrome, and lawyers and other people. And so arguing can be a reinforcer. In fact, they don't want you to stop. Okay? Also, getting angry. That gives him or her power over you. And if they get a rise out of you, that is something that you are inadvertently, you're feeding into the behavior. And also, sometimes, for some individuals, they're looking for shock and dismay. And I have developed the ability to look very bored in the face of some outrageous behaviors, and that's what you have to do. You have to look really bored. Put your clothes back on now, Joey, and we'll go home, because I think the mall's going to close. Okay? You do not get excited. Your response is not designed to end the behavior. Your response is mainly designed not to encourage the behavior in the future, and just to manage the behavior. You don't want the behavior to create a crisis, if possible. You want not to reinforce it. You want to manage the behavior in the setting where it takes place. Now, this is the problem with workshops and schools. They want to call you up and have you come get the child and manage the behavior at home. And of course, they couldn't design a program for reinforcing the behavior that would be more effective. So the school or the workshop absolutely has to have their own plan for managing the behavior in the setting where it takes place, and their management of the behavior cannot in any way reinforce that behavior, and it follows the same rules that you have to follow at home. And that's why it's so important for the response to be consistent from person to person and location to location. Now, one mother once pointed out to me that her child would go to school and was having a huge number of temper tantrums at school, but she wasn't having any problems at all at home. What did I think? My answer was that either they are not managing the child appropriately at school, and that's why he's having temper tantrums at school, or she's not managing the child appropriately at home, and when he goes to school and they are setting limits that he's not used to having set, the child is having temper tantrums. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the location of the temper tantrum is the source of the problem. Training your team then includes all of these basic skills. These are man-to-man skills, not zone skills. One thing you never want to do not get bogged down in trying to understand the cause of the behavior while it's going on. That's something you will do after it's all over. While it's going on, you simply manage the behavior. You never, even if it's true, you never acknowledge that the temper tantrum was justified. This refers to the kind of situation where somebody is disappointed because you made a mistake, or you told them one thing and then it turned out to be something else, and they have a temper tantrum of some form, some meltdown in behavior or yelling and screaming, and you sympathize with them over their disappointment, but do not take on responsibility for the behavior. You've got to let them have responsibility. I'm sorry you were disappointed, but that is not a reason to throw things. You have to do that, no matter how guilty you feel about having messed up. Okay. These are skills that you want to teach your team. During the tantrum, they should learn how to ignore, to redirect, to suggest another behavior. Now, usually if someone is just in a shutdown and they're not moving and they're refusing to do something, that's when redirection is useful. You do not simply tell them, stop that. You have to give them an alternative behavior. If they are demanding that you answer a question, you do not answer that question or make any decisions as long as the tantrum is going on. And of course, you do have to manage your own anger. And sometimes one parent has to step in, or one staff member has to step in and say, I'll take care of this now. And sometimes a staff member or a parent has to say, I need help. Can you give me a break? That's one way to manage. That's healthy escape and avoidance when your own anger is starting to take over. After the behavior is over, and how long it lasts is not necessarily under your control, but after it's over, there will be consequences that were already built into the program. Now, I want to say that you do not increase the severity of the consequence just because it was a really awful behavior. Okay? So the consequence is there, and it's the same, and it is not proportionate. When the child is really calmed down, and it may take until the next day, you give him an opportunity to apologize. And with younger children or possibly lower functioning children, you need to actually help them script their own apology. You have to give them the words, and don't worry about whether or not the apology is sincere. Okay? Just accept it at face value, and even if it's completely insincere in your judgment, it's a good ritual to go through. And you respond to the apology with specific words. I forgive you. They need to hear that. And so as opposed to that's okay or all right or something, they want to hear those words, or it helps them to hear those words. And then later or at that time, depending on how upset the child is about the whole thing, it's useful to do some debriefing. Remember yesterday when you threw your shoe out the car window because we didn't stop where you thought we were going to stop? Can you think of another reason, another way you could have told me that you were angry? Actually, you should back up from that. You can say, how did you feel when you threw your shoe out the window? Okay. Oh, you were angry. Do you remember why you were angry? The funny thing is they may not remember why they were angry. But you want to reprocess the whole event because you're trying to build some problem-solving skills for the future. Now, this is slow work. This is not going to provide fruit immediately. But I've been really impressed with how well our folks will respond to that. There are some standard responses that we find more appropriate most of the time for certain frequent Prader-Willi behaviors. One, of course, is that it's always a low-key response. The child who's very anxious needs frequent reassurances. It's almost part of his infrastructure. He needs the reassurance even before he expresses his anxiety. Crying and tantrums require a low-key response. You don't give in, and you can even comfort. Perseveration. This one can drive you nuts. But I like a little routine that I learned from our case manager. the child who is asking the same question over and over again can be given a quota. You've asked me about the picnic tomorrow quite a few times, and I've given you the answer. Now you can ask me 3 more times, and then I'm not going to answer anymore. So the next time the child asks the question about the picnic, you answer the question, because he needs that answer. That's why he's asking. And then you say, now I'm going to answer this question 2 more times, and then I'm not going to answer you anymore. And the next time the child asks the same question, you give him the answer, or her the answer, and then you remind her that you're going to answer this question 1 more time, and then you're not going to answer it anymore. See, you're perseverating back. You get to the question again, and you answer the question, and then you remind her that she's used up all her questions and that you aren't going to answer the question anymore. I'm going to ignore you when you ask the question, but I'm not being rude. It's just because I know now that you really do know the answer. And you can check and have him or her repeat the answer to make sure they know it. And then you don't answer anymore. Okay? Now you might get a tantrum, but you have prepared the child that you are not going to answer. So it's not a surprise. You're managing his or her expectations. And also you're dealing with your own feelings of, I'm being really rude. Because here this person is addressing me, this person is talking to me, and I'm not responding. So you have to prepare yourself and the child that this is the appropriate way to respond. It doesn't completely eliminate the perseveration, but we have seen it work quite nicely. Arguing, this is real simple, and this is a great skill to have if you have teenagers. The key to arguing is that you don't give reasons, because people can argue with reasons. What you give is rules. You simply restate the rules. You don't debate about whether or not it's fair. You don't debate about whether or not the rule is what the rule is. You simply restate the rule, and if necessary, you perseverate on the rule. And do not get sucked into an argument. Food stealing. The consequence should be already agreed upon, predetermined, and it's really a token consequence in the sense that if someone steals 500 calories, they will not necessarily lose 500 calories from the next meal. The consequence that we have recommended is the loss of a single starch from the next meal if they're stealing. Well, sure, if they're looking at the occasion, you know, donut or that half a potato, you know, it's a no-brainer. But the fact is, although you won't admit this out loud, the donut shouldn't have been there, okay, if they're able to steal it. But there should be a consequence. It gives them responsibility for their own behavior. You can also do some problem solving afterwards. I see you took the donut, okay. What could you have done? You could have told Mom that somebody left the donuts out, okay. All right, they may laugh. But it doesn't hurt to do that problem solving with them. The other problem, I think the biggest situation, difficult situation, is when you're like 95% certain they took the donut, but you're not 100%. So do we do a consequence or not? Here's my advice. You're going to have to make a decision, either go with it or let it go. But if you're all but certain, make a decision, and you're going to consequence it. You announce the consequence, the rule, repeat the rule about that. And if they argue, hold firm. If you have any doubts, don't show them. What's the worst thing that can happen? You may consequence a behavior that didn't happen. But it's not capital punishment. And by and large, most of the time when you're 95, 99% certain, you just didn't actually see them take the food. So the important thing is that if they object to the consequence on the grounds that they didn't do it, that you don't waver, because denial is a huge part of Prader-Willi syndrome. Their ability to deny food stealing in the face of overwhelming evidence is pretty phenomenal. Okay. Incontinence is a difficult problem, but basically, as for other children, you never punish it, and you never blame them for the incontinence, but you give them responsibility for the incontinence. The responsibility is to clean up. That's what restitution is. And it can be supportive restitution. That is, you can guide them in the cleanup. You can assist them if they need assistance in the cleanup, but you still give them responsibility. That may not eliminate the incontinence, but it's simply an appropriate way to respond to the problem. Skin picking. The fundamental for mild skin picking is your best bet is low attention. You can, saying stop picking is never particularly effective. Redirecting and distracting, it does work. What about outrageous behavior? Running away, or taking off your clothes, or waving a knife around, something that's really pretty scary. Well, here, just safety is your first priority. If you can, after safety is established, you can ignore, look, and sound, board, and redirect to another activity. You find yourself maybe saying some pretty ridiculous things, but that is the appropriate response. And then you need to sit down with your team, whether it's your husband or your wife or your group home team, and have a planned response to the future behavior, because if you have a planned response, it's a lot easier to react in a low-key manner, as opposed to when you're trying to figure out, oh, great, now what do I do? You know, when you're trying to problem solve at the same time, that's a little much. Everyone needs to know what the planned response is. You inform the child of the planned response, okay? And then you have to be consistent. Remember that the food security is the core of all this behavior management, and when all of these are in place, you have behavior and weight are controlled with the same techniques. Thank you.